Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Carl Sweeney, who is the host of the fantastic podcast, the Movie Palace Podcast. Carl, welcome back.
Hello, it's great to be back, Robert. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, it's been a while since we've been together on this show, hasn't it? But we've been
Yeah,
able to podcast together on my show a couple of times more recently, and it's always great to talk to you. So really
you
happy
as
to be with you.
you as well. And we did little. I think the last time you were here, we did Little Caesar, which is also a classic Warner Brothers gangster film. And today we're doing The Public Enemy. So I'll just read a brief little synopsis for people if you haven't seen it or if you haven't seen it in a while. It's two young Chicago hoodlums, Tom Powers and Matt Doyle, rise up from their poverty stricken slum life to become petty thieves, bootleggers, and cold blooded killers. But with street notoriety and newfound wealth, the duo feels the heat from the cops and rival gangsters both. Despite his ruthless criminal reputation, Tom tries to remain connected to his family. However, gang warfare and the need for revenge eventually pull him away. This was directed by William A. Wellman. It was written by Cubic Glassman and John Bright. That's the book, sorry. The book is called Beer and Blood. The screenplay was by Harvey F. Few. And it starred James Cagney, of course, Jean Harlow, Edward Woods, and Joan Blondell. Okay, so do you remember the first time you saw this, Carl, and what did you initially think?
I do remember the first time. So I podcasted on this film, I think a few years ago now, but
Oh,
that wasn't the first time actually. But what I remember is I went for a job. It was a teaching job, teaching about film, and they wanted somebody who could teach about film. They were doing a module on film genres and a module on TV history. So I sort of went along to the interview, just a short term job, and I did a presentation about gangster films, and I was looking more at like The Godfather, Goodfellas, all those more recent kind of films that we know and love. Um, and at the end of it, they said, "Yeah, okay, you can do this 12-week thing about gangster films." And at that point, I had to think, well, okay, I actually haven't seen a lot of what we would think of as classic gangster films, so I need to go and watch a bunch of films and really get into the history. So that was the point when I went to back to watch, Little Caesar, the original Scarface, The Public Enemy. Those films that sort of epitomized the early 30s gangster film. Of course, there were many more, but I think very often it gets boiled down to those three movies, doesn't it?
yeah,
It's kind of that time period.
yeah,
Um, so I remember seeing The Public Enemy, and out of those titles I just mentioned, I think this was the one I liked the best, and I still think that. I
yeah.
think it's been a
I
while since I've
agree.
seen Scarface actually, but
Yeah,
I think this one is really entertaining. I like it quite a bit. I think what I was thinking about last night as I was watching is, in a way, it's quite balanced in a funny sort of way. Like it does get into a little bit some of the things that have made this guy tough and his background and his family and some of that, but I don't think it's too heavy-handed about it. I don't feel like it's beating you over the head too much. It has real brutality, but then actually it's almost quite an elegant film as well. And a lot
yeah,
of the really brutal stuff is kind of suggested, and
right.
I think it does that in quite an interesting way. And it has quite funny moments. I do find it quite funny when you see the Prohibition Eve and they're pushing like the the prams full of booze down the street, and it's got funny moments, and it's also quite dark and horrific, and it doesn't pretend that these gangsters like Tom Powers are not appealing figures, but I think it does make you question, is he actually psychotic? Is it right to like somebody like this? So like I said, I found it quite entertaining and balanced. How about you? What's your history with this one?
I was trying to remember when I first saw it, and I can't quite pinpoint it. But what I remember from, I suppose, 2007, yeah, the film that Scorsese did, The Departed, his gangster film. Actually, when he won the Golden Globe, I think it was the Golden Globe. He said, "Oh, I thought we." He goes, "I looked at it like we were just doing Angels with Dirty Faces," and I so I can see what he means actually because there is a similarity. Oh, that's also, as you know, also with Cagney, and he loved he loves, I should say, the Warner Brothers gangster films. And on the DVD of The Departed, there was a a little documentary called Scorsese on Scorsese that was done, I think, in 2004. And I remember when that came out, but I didn't see it. And then they put it on the DVD, and he was talking about these Warner Brothers gangster films, like I just mentioned. So that's what I remember. And, he said some really great things about this film. That's what I remember my first visual memory of it. So I can't, but I must have seen it around then. So we're thinking 2007, 2006. So I can't quite recall the first time I saw it, but I've certainly seen it over the years, every now and then. And I on my Patreon, I have a what I call a Cagney in the movies video.
Yeah.
So I every month review one of his performances. And about early last year, I did this one.
Hmm.
So I saw it again recently. And every time I see it, I see something new. And I think ultimately it's so, for some reason I think that it's like Little Caesar and Scarface, like rise and fall, but it actually isn't. It isn't like that at all. Because he doesn't become like the head of a gang or a big like kingpin. Like he's ultimately, he becomes successful, him and his friend, but they are ultimately muscles and bootleggers, and they work with a crew. And so I also found that pretty appealing. But what really stuck out to me last night when the night before last, I watched it again, was its exploration of masculinity. What really popped out to me, because Tom Powers is this guy who's his brother bossed him around. We see his father was a police officer, which I forgot his father was a cop. His father was a police officer. We see that scene where he's hitting him with a strap, and he tries to act tough. Like, I love when the kid actor said, "It's like, how do you want him, up or down his
Down.
pants?"
Yeah.
Right. So he's trying to act like the father can't get to him. So I found that really appealing, because even later we see his need to be tough is so strong. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the scene where he's getting tailored with by getting new clothes, that they made that character a very feminine gay man flirting with him, and you see he reacts in a very threatening way to that guy. And so I found that aspect of the film really appealing. And also, of course, just they really do empathize with him. And even though, like you said, they don't shy away from his brutality, but they do show him as a human being, and not just, oh, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. We'll get into those title cards they put at the beginning and the end, which seems sort of like, it feels like they were forced to do that or something, because it's not just, this doesn't, it almost sounds like what they're going to show you is a documentation, right? And it really isn't. It is a story about humans who are doing and have really bad qualities. But I don't know if that was anything that stuck out to you, this exploration of what it means to be a man and his need to be tough, even though he's ultimately like a very frightened, scared kid in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was thinking about when I said, it does get into some of that, but in a way that's not too like it's trying to teach you a lesson, I
No,
suppose,
no.
because it is exploring like where does that hardness come from? Where does that sort of person come from? And you see, don't you, like he was already like mischievous and quite callous
Yeah.
as a child, tripping up that girl and everything. And like you say, the father being so stern and foreboding. Like there's a shot, isn't there, where he looks really scary. The father is
Oh
he's
yeah.
as
Yeah.
Tom's walking up the drive or whatever it is, and you just get that sense that he was toughened at an early age. And I wonder if the implication, in a way, is that because the mother seems to be quite ineffectual, doesn't she? And we
Yes.
know that the father dies at some point, and I wonder if the implication there is that she wasn't sufficiently sort of stern enough to keep
Right.
somebody like him under control. But yeah, I think Cagney as Tom Powers, that's one of the massively interesting things about this film, I think. And I was going to ask you about him because I know you're watching more of his movies, I think, probably than I've ever seen on your show. And you hear that story, don't you, about this film? How, I mean, there are different versions of the story, but about how Cagney wasn't originally in the lead
Yes.
role. It was going to be the other actor who
Yeah.
ends up in the supporting role. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I've heard that William Wellman was quite emphatic in later years that they started production and they'd filmed a few days. And at that point, they looked at the rushes and swapped the actors around. And then there's another version, which is like 2 weeks before production began. Cagney had had a supporting role in an earlier film and had kind of stolen that movie away from the lead actors or something. So they wanted to give him a push. And
Yeah.
maybe it didn't happen as after filming began. And I don't really know what the truth is. I don't know what your sense of that is, but it does seem like the two kids, um, the two child actors are sort of playing the wrong roles in a way, doesn't it, in the
Well,
film?
their
Whereby,
height, yeah, because one's taller than the other, and Edward Woods is taller than than
yeah,
Cagney. But then again, I wasn't so sure because that line I mentioned when he goes to his father, "How do you want it, up or down?" He sounded like Cagney talks. I don't know if that was
yeah,
intentional on that actor's part. So it's really hard to say. It didn't really. I only really started to think about that height aspect when I read that people at the time were saying, well, yeah, they must have switched it during filming because the kids are their height is quite different. But it didn't really stand out to me. And like I said, that he seems to be doing a Cagney, like what in Angels with Dirty Faces, where we also see the young
yeah,
Cagney that he's also very much trying doing I don't want to say an imitation because he was quite good. He made it his own, but he's modeling that off the behavior and mannerisms of Cagney. So it's hard to say what happened exactly there, but I mean, nonetheless, thank God they switched it because I think we would have had a very different film with Edward Woods, who that's the one thing about one of the flaws of this film is Cagney is he was always so natural and spontaneous and effortless on camera. Whereas, we started to see in the 30s once the talkies came, so the actors still were trying to figure out how to adjust, and so often you get maybe more over the top performances. I think even back then the audio, the microphones, they had to actually talk louder, so sometimes it sounds
yeah.
like they had to sort of project, so it's not always the actor's fault that they're coming
Yeah.
off larger. But
And
that's where it's
they kind of elongate a lot of the dialogue, don't they? You get this strange
exactly.
kind of drawn out delivery, and
Yeah.
it's almost like Cagney shows you that was never necessary in a role like this because he doesn't
Well,
seem
that's the
to
thing. Yeah.
do that, does he? Yeah,
No, no, he doesn't. He's doesn't have a false note about him. I do find actually in some of his later performances, even though I think he always gave great performances, there is sometimes a bit of a push, particularly when he's getting mad. He seems to push it just a little bit. Not too much. In this film, he doesn't though at all. I found him to be totally realistic and spontaneous and instinctive. But that's one of the flaws of the film is that Jean Harlow and Edward Woods and Donald Cook, his brother, is also quite bad. I would say the mother is really good, Beryl Mercer. I thought she was quite good, but it doesn't bother me. It's sort
yeah,
of like I don't mind if someone is really that bad.
yeah.
Unless it's like, because even though some of the actors aren't good, it's such a powerful story, and there's so much good that's happening within it that I don't know how you feel. Just if anything throws you at all.
I mean, the one I would single out is I do think Jean Harlow's performance is quite odd, and there
Yeah,
are some really
she's
unusual
she's
line
pretty
readings.
she's pretty flat. Yeah, she's
I
wasn't
think she is, and she has
she got
some line.
better after this, I think, like in her later films, but this was
Yeah, I
not
think when you have that knowledge that she got better, it's fine. But I think if this
right.
had been the first time I'd ever seen her, or heard of her, I'd have been
Yeah.
unimpressed. But I think you're right that a lot of the other actors, not all of them, because I quite like the actor who played I think it was Paddy Ryan. I think that's his name. I thought he was quite good. But some of them, like the actor playing Putty
Oh yes,
Nose,
yes,
and
Patty Ryan. Oh yeah, yeah, he was good. He was the one of the gang members. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, he was quite good.
But I think that what I heard is that there were quite a few British actors in this film, and they don't feel properly of a piece with this situation in a way that Cagney really does. I think that he's so powerful and expressive and explosive that it's a fantastic performance.
Oh
And
yeah,
I'd heard, I don't know a huge amount about his background, but I'd heard that he had a sense of, he'd grown up in city streets and
yeah,
sort of knew that milieu a little bit. And I think just he created like a classic example of, those kind of prototypical gangsters we think of the 30s, and there's so many great details here. Like, he obviously likes the cars, and
yeah.
when he turns up at a nightclub and he's driving a car with gears, and the valet takes it
Oh
and
yeah,
doesn't know how to drive a car with gears, and
yeah,
all that sort of stuff. And I think Cagney is just a ridiculously charismatic actor in a way, and his body language, some of the little gestures, like he's got this kind of two punch
yeah, yeah,
jab that he does all the time, and
yeah.
like the moment to go back to Harlow when he's kind of dancing in the street. Do you remember after they've picked her up and she goes away and
Yes,
he
yes.
does this kind of weird little dance shuffle in the
Yeah,
street, and it's a very it's a performance that's full of vitality. I think the voice is a lot of it. I don't know what you think, but some of those other actors, even allowing for they're trying to act in a different way because it's the early sound era sort
yeah,
of conventions, but his voice just, a lot of those early gangster actors, we think about when we talked about Edward G. Robinson, that kind of muscular way of talking, I think
yeah,
is so distinctive and fitting because it's almost like the voice becomes kind of part of their armor, part of their weaponry in a way, that um, it just really suits that kind of that world.
yeah.
And yeah, I think so. He had all the attributes, I think, for a role like this, and so many great moments, aren't there? Like the grapefruit scene, which became kind of talked about, and when he spits beer in the face of the
Oh
barman.
yeah.
Like I think he's, I think he's fantastic throughout the film,
Oh
really.
yeah, yeah. Well, that that's an example of his showing his brutality, which I'm glad that they didn't shy away from, because to spit in someone's face, I mean, that's pretty awful. We do see him commit murder. I mean, he kills a cop. He that you so I read some people online thought that there's like an Oedipus complex there, like you wanted to kill his father, but I'm like, I don't get you didn't get the impression you wanted to be with his mother. I never got that impression, but I can see the connection with like wanting to kill the father, uh, um, and then killing the cop. I just looked up the actor who plays him as a boy, Frank Coughlin Jr., and he's got freckles, all over his face. So it makes me wonder if maybe the story is true that even before they started shooting, Cagney was in the part, because he kind of does look like Cagney a little bit. But yeah, the that that really appealed to me, was this him and his friend Matt Doyle, who were like brothers, and like you said, they're engaging in petty crimes. We go through 19 what I believe it's 1910 when it starts, or 1909.
1909, I think, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, 1909, and it goes right into the 20s. So we're covering, and it's a fast film, but it's rich at the same time. There's a lot. It moves quickly, but it doesn't lack for any kind of substance. And you know, like I said, we get this guy who and his friend, and they are engaging in petty crime, and then this that one character who even as kids was sort of shortchanging them. That scene where he brings in all those like stolen little clocks or watches, it
Yeah.
looks like, and he's because they're kids, he tries to give them less money and shortchange them and thing, and that's where, when we see that he says one day I'll give you a big job, and they go on this heist. And I love even when he gives the scene where he gives them the guns, because here's a guy who, these guys, particularly Tom, who, because of the fact that he was bossed around by, his brother told him what to do and bossed him around, his father, well, as we saw, was hit him, and so he felt powerless, and so the guns become a feel of power, you know, a feel of strength. And just the way that they were both looking at it, and like this new lover, it almost, you know, felt like. But what I liked was that they did, which I don't see in a lot of gangster films even now, or is that when they go on the heist, they're so nervous, you know, and that's what sort of screws them up because he sees that big
The
bear, like
bear,
stuffed
yeah.
bear, and he shoots it, and that's what triggers the cops off. And I just thought, what an unusual choice, because I don't think I've, you know, you never see that sense of fear in gangsters, and so they really sort of gradually showed you how he comes to sort of armor himself in this as a real tough guy. But it's not, he's not just born that way. I mean, he's mischievous, but it's something that he's trying to design. I don't know if that was anything that popped out to you.
I suppose as you were talking there, I was thinking about, you mentioned when they're given the gun. And I think the gangster says something to them like, here's a present from Santa Claus or something like that. And I think what's interesting about this film in a way is like, I think like genuinely it remains like just purely an entertaining film to sit down and watch. But then when you start to think about how topical a lot of some
Yeah,
of this stuff is, and
right.
the fact that this is what the middle of 1931, and I think Little Caesar came out right at the start of that year. And actually, as I understand it, somebody like Al Capone would have been in the press from like
Yes.
1929. I think he gets indicted in the summer of 1931. So it's a
Yeah.
fascinating film because I think it must be dependent in a large way on, the public being interested in that kind of thing that they've read about in the newspapers and all that sort of stuff, what these criminals are like, what their lifestyles are. And
Right.
I suppose the comparison now, what I'm saying with the when they're given the guns, and there's always this talk about them getting on financially. And I suppose that's really interesting in regard to somebody like Capone, isn't it? Because like he would have been presenting himself as a kind of businessman. And I think he sort of said that to the press, that I'm just a businessman, and
Yeah.
I'm taking the American opportunity and things like that. We need to seize our opportunities with both hands, he used to say, things like that. I'm supplying a popular demand. And I think in this film, a lot of that is how it's framed, isn't it? It's about, what am I going to do with so much dough? And I'm going to make you big shots. And
Yeah.
like you say, they go to visit the tailor and they're getting these nicer clothes. They're getting a nice car to drive. They're meeting attractive women. And you're right. There isn't like the rise and fall in terms of him rising to the top of that organization. Because even like, although he sleeps with his boss's girlfriend, he didn't want
Oh,
to. And
right.
he wasn't trying to sort of take over that role, was he? But there is that sense of him sort of climbing the ladder and making a success of himself, but sort of doing it the wrong way. And then his brother, I think he says it, his brother's learning how to be poor, but like he's in theory doing things the right way, and he's patriotic, and
Right.
he's the head of the family after the father dies. And I don't know. I think what I liked about it when I said it was balanced is that actually I don't think the brother was too idealized in a way. Like it does seem like when Tom
No, his
accuses
brother's
his
he's quite an asshole.
yeah, and when Tom accuses him of stealing, the way his brother reacts to me, that suggests that there is something to the accusation that his brother's not fully pure. Otherwise, I feel
Right.
like he would have reacted in a different way. So yeah, I think sort of seeing it in those terms is quite interesting to me. That it's 1931, the audience is maybe thinking about some of these real figures. And that's one of the interesting things with these gangsters in real life, isn't it? How notorious they became, and
Yeah.
that element of they're almost like folk heroes in a weird sort of way sometimes.
Well, I like, I'm glad you brought that up, because I like that. Yeah, they don't just portray Mike Powers, his brother, as like the good brother, like, because like he is. Yeah, I mean, it's common for the older brother to be lecturing the younger brother, but it seems as though in this relationship that never evolved. You know, I think that was part of the resentment. And even another, you know, really interesting scene is when they get into that argument, and then Mike punches him and he falls and, you know, breaks a whole chair. um Again, it's him feeling powerless, that he's not tough enough. And even later, as he rises, they get into another confrontation and he punches Tom again. And to think that he doesn't punch him back, you know, it's almost like it's that thing of childhood where it's like there's still a sense of fear of the older brother. He does like he rips up the money and throws it at him,
Yeah.
but he does not punch him back. And you would it's so in I mean, what an interesting character, like this guy who's like spitting in people's faces and killed a cop, and he's this rough bootlegger. He's hired as a muscle, and yet his brother hits him, and he doesn't strike back. I mean, that's really compelling to me. But even though he is like Mike is like this war hero, he is also he's right about that. Obviously, Tom is doing wrong things, and he's become a murderer and a criminal. And we see that scene where they bring all the beer to the table after he's
And
come
that big
back,
barrel,
and
the
yeah,
massive
that big
barrel. Yeah.
massive barrel, and then he just throws it across the room, and he calls him a murderer and everything. I mean, it's pretty rich, but I'm glad that they did not just say, oh, he's the good brother, and Tom's the bad, because he's also he calls him stupid a lot. He's and there's that aspect of the two of them competing, right? Like brothers do. It's like, well, I'm smarter than you. I'm going to night school, and he's like, oh, well, screw you, and reading poetry, and like,
Yeah.
uh, again, I mean, it's there's almost a lot of it to relate to. The stronger father and the mother, particularly then, who didn't have the strength to maybe stand up to tell the father to back off, and things like that. It's pretty it's pretty nuanced, I would say.
And I do feel for his brother, that conversation he's going to have with his mother right at the end of the movie
Oh,
after
yeah.
the his brother's corpse has been dropped off, and how's that going to go? And I had forgotten some of the war hero stuff. I sort of remembered that his brother went off to fight in the war, but I'd forgotten that when he comes back, you sort of see that. I suppose he would have thought of it as shell shock, but
Yes.
today we'd call it PTSD. I sort of
Right.
forgot that he showed signs of that
Yes.
in the film. But speaking of the war, actually, I think you touched on this, but it is really interesting, isn't it? That this film is giving you a kind of historical perspective, because that's sort of not how you remember these gangster films from really early on, is it? Like you sort of remember them as like they're in and out and they're 80 minutes long or
Right.
whatever, and they're sort of really brisk and efficient. And it is a brisk and efficient film, but the fact that it takes you from the pre-prohibition era, and I like the way that's depicted, the way you see how central drinking is actually to that community. Like
Yes.
you see all the drinks being poured. I think there's a funeral scene, isn't there, where there's like a priest sat there drinking with a policeman, and
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I think there's kind of a really there's like a deftness to the way a lot of that's presented, but you sort of don't think of it that way, do you? You sort of think like later films like The Godfather take a massive historical sweep, but like you say, this film drops you in 1909, and then 1915 and 17, and
Yeah.
Prohibition coming in, and I think part of that, from what I understand, is that Warner Brothers sort of moved towards what they called headline films, films that are exploiting some kind of contemporary, whether it's a debate or something notorious or newsworthy. And part of the way you can justify doing a film like this is you provide a historical argument for, like like the foreword and the afterword says this is a problem that society needs to solve. And part of the
Right.
way you sort of say that this is a problem and we're trying to look at it seriously is you sort of drill into the causes and the historical factors that sort of come about. And I don't, obviously the foreword and the afterword seem quite tacked on, don't they? But I think
They do.
actually the
Yeah.
way it does backtrack to pre-prohibition, and it shows you that kind of frenzied thing where everybody's stocking up on booze on the night before the Volstead Act comes into force. It's well done, I think. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's not an epic film, but it covers a lot in that short running time, I think.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'd love to read those forwards and afterwards cards. Yeah. So the first one was the forward. It is the ambition of the authors of The Public Enemy to honestly depict an environment that exists today in a certain strata of American life rather than glorify the hoodlum or the criminal. While the story of The Public Enemy is essentially a true story, all names and characters appearing herein are purely fictional. And then at the last one at the end is the end of Tom Powers is the end of every hoodlum. The Public Enemy is not a man, nor is it a character. It is a problem that sooner or later we, the public, must solve. So I think you're right in the sense that there is, I suppose, they are sort of showing you, they're trying to show people why people make these choices, and then at the same time, well, we have to do something about it, even though it feels a little like they're like a school lesson the way they put it. But I can't help. I mean, it's possible that because Capone was also so, he was like, he was like famous. I mean, and he was in the press, and I think that that was a real concern,
Yeah.
which you didn't, which later, many years later, someone like John Gotti that was similar. Like he sort of embraced the press and things like that, and he became sort of famous in that way for bad reasons. And I think that's why that may have been why they were like, oh, people were they're not they're not looking at this the right way. But so I think they did such a good job here where they show the brutality while empathizing, but at the same time, it's true. Like, and I think we said this with our little Caesar talk. There is something appealing about these people who like live outside of the law, and not that I would do it, or I encourage anyone to do it, but I think there is something about people who like don't take crap and stand up for themselves easily and don't get bossed around and do what they want. I think part of us all would want to be able to do that if we could, but obviously
Yeah.
you know, you can't. Consequences are too great, and
Yeah.
these are people who do it, but they pay for it.
And
you
I
know,
wonder how much of that for an audience in 1931, I wonder how much all the disruption that the Great Depression brought about is
right?
factoring into the fact that somebody like Tom Powers would actually be very appealing, that I've heard it said that gangster films kind of expose like the dark side of the American dream in a way, that there is a way to get ahead and rise to the top, but to do that, you need to break the rules. And
Yes, it's a good point.
that kind of lends it, sort of this sort of story then lends itself well to that rise and fall thing where you can kind of live vicariously through the
Yes,
gangster as they're sort of getting the suits and the shoes and the girlfriends and the cars, and then it sort of reality has to dawn, and all that has to be taken away, and they have to sort of get their retribution, or get their comeuppance at the
yes.
end of it. um I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, that they look quite tame now, these films, but they were very controversial at the time.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
we talked about this with Little Caesar, but this then coming a few months later, and I believe doing even better sort of commercially than Little Caesar had done. And I think Will Hayes of Hayes Code infamy had said that just as Public Enemy's coming out, he said that the public's kind of beginning to get tired of a lot of this. It's beginning to get tired of like this hard boiled literature and this stuff on the screen, and then is proved wrong in the sense that this film is like really successful. But
Yeah.
I just thought it was funny. I was reading a book yesterday, Forbidden Hollywood by Mark A. Vieira, which talks a lot about the some of these controversial films of the pre-code era, and he includes in there some of the complaint letters that came into Will Hayes about this film. And it's just kind of funny how one of them said, such pictures are more destructive to the morality of our country than any other single force today. The public expects you to censor these movies. And that was an anonymous letter, and the person just signed their name as the word disgusted. And actually, I believe there were censorship issues with this film, weren't there? I think the tailor scene, the
Yeah, well,
effeminate
they
tailor
cut
is
that
one.
out year after the once what we call the pre-code high era ended in 35, or was it 34? I always get that wrong.
So yeah, it starts to be rigorously enforced in 34, doesn't it? I think,
34.
yeah,
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 34. So when the film was re-released years later, they took out that scene, the guy with the tailor, I guess obviously because he was clearly gay and flirting. And they also took out, which we'll get to, is the scene where his boss, where he sleeps with his boss. And some, I was reading some different reviews of the film, and some people look at that as if she raped him, which is we don't see it, but it's certainly, let's say, strong. He was strongly taken advantage of when he was
yeah.
hammered. So that's a touchy thing. But is that, I guess, suppose the fact that he doesn't remember it, he must have been. He was really. I shouldn't laugh, perhaps, but he was really. hammered. I'm
Well, he definitely did say to her a couple of times, like, "Leave me alone." You know,
yes, yes,
words to that
yes,
effect, didn't he? Yeah. As I heard it, that was that scene is kind of because she sort of turns the light off and then walks back to him, and I think maybe
yes.
there were some censorship issues where it kind of cuts 10 seconds before that, so you don't see her go back towards him. But
Oh, is that
um,
right? Okay.
at some point, I might that may have been for a re-release because I'd seen an
So
interview with
yeah, the
Martin
ones
Scorsese.
later, yeah, the
Yeah,
ones
because he
after
talked
this,
about seeing the film on a double bill with Little Caesar, and I think that when he was talking about that, I think there was a release in the 50s. So I think
yeah.
maybe him seeing that film at that time is seeing the truncated version with the scene with the tailors hacked to bits. And I believe there's a scene with it's where the grapefruit scene is, but Matt and Joan Blondell are kind of in the other room, and some of the sounds of them kind of giggling and laughing together were kind of cut for being too intimate or something, and have only been
Oh, is that
partially
right? Oh,
restored.
wow,
Yeah, you
wow.
can kind of hear him laughing away
Yeah,
now when you watch that scene.
yeah.
Um, but another letter I thought was fascinating. Again, these complaint letters. Here's one: these gang pictures. That's terrible kid stuff. They're doing nothing but harm to the younger element of the country. I don't blame the censors for trying to bar them. And that comment was from Al Capone himself,
Oh,
which I think is
wow,
kind of funny. Yeah.
wow.
Um, but there was that idea, wasn't there? I think it looks kind of odd now, so far down the line, and films are so much more violent or whatever. But
Yes,
the idea that these films could be like a curriculum of crime in a way, that they're sort
yeah,
of teaching kids how to, you know, rob whatever it might be, rob a safe or rob a
right.
bank or whatever. Um, the women are interesting though, like you say. That character of Jane, like the boss's girlfriend, that's kind of you don't really see that kind of character, do you, in a way where she's like you say
No,
taking advantage of him,
no.
and you sort of think about the gangster having a like a mall or whatever who's kind of you know, he's showing off his girlfriend to the other gangsters, or there's a woman he sees fit to marry, or there's a mother. But there are actually a few interesting women in this film, and like I say, that Jane character,
Yes.
I mean, I don't know what's kind of motivating her in a way. It's kind of odd, but not the kind of woman you normally see in these films, I don't think.
Well, and not only in these films, but I can't even think this was so interesting about pre-code, right? Is that you see things that would even now maybe make people uncomfortable. I mean, I can't think. I mean, we've seen many films where men rape women and stories about that, but I don't think I've ever seen a film where it's the shoes on the other foot. The only thing that comes to mind is like Disclosure with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, which is about a woman like sexually assaulting and harassing a man. And there are some others, I'm sure. But yeah, I can't. It's quite shocking, and what's even more disturbing about it is what it actually does to Tom, because at that point, just to catch people up, is that they're told not to leave that place because their boss um has been killed by a horse, which is another black humor. We'll get into that as well. And so now that's weakened their gang. So these rival gangs are trying to attack them and take over their territory, I suppose. And so they're told, don't leave this place. Don't leave their place. And they don't go anywhere. And then when that happens, that sets him off, and he leaves. And to think that, and then moments later, then his best friend gets gunned down. They're just waiting with those guns in a nearby building for them to leave. And to think that his life is so destroyed in a matter of hours, because what we also saw before that is he falls in love with Jean Harlow. And so he's got his success that he wanted. He's got this beautiful woman, and he's got love in his life. And then all of us, and for someone who really wanted to be tough, to then have a woman, whether people think that was rape or sexual harassment, or taking it, whatever, what have you. It's certainly an assault, to say the least. For that to happen to him, because of the way he looks at manhood and masculinity, that is, I mean, that's loaded, to think that much happens to him in such a short amount of time, which then leads to that great rain scene where he goes, and it's like he's smiling before he goes in. It's almost as if he knows he's gonna die. It's like a suicide mission. That was, to me, was so strong, and it happened so fast. And I think that that's how it is for these guys. I mean, they can get killed walking out the door. Their whole life can change in a matter of, that's the price they pay for these going into these worlds. Was that your impression?
Yeah, but it can be taken away in a second,
Yeah.
absolutely. And like we say, it's kind of, if it's kind of a rise and fall story, even if it's not, he's rising to the top, but
Right,
he's sort
right.
of working his way to the ladder a bit, and then
Yes,
he's
yes,
it's
yes.
taken away. And I think what's so interesting about that as a film, as you know, as a device that's used in many other gangster films, you know, I think what's so interesting about it here is it's almost like that's a kind of plot pattern you would put on a Greek tragedy or something, but they're doing it with a film that's actually modeled on what's happening in the newspapers, like at that moment. You know, it's kind
Right.
of a weird combination in a way.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's been any has there ever anything been quite like that, you know, in terms of applying these kind of Greek tragedy models to something that's really topical? I don't know, but I think you're absolutely right about that shootout in the street. I think that's a great scene. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think through most of the film, it's really well made. But then I think it's almost at that point like the imagery gets even more kind of expressive than it has been before in a way, because the look on his face is so memorable, and the way the rain is like teeming down, and
Great choice.
the purposefulness of him as he's going into that building. And yeah, what about the approach to violence here in a way?
Oh
Because
yeah.
I almost feel like it's kind of a cliche to say, isn't it? Like, oh, I can, you know, sometimes what you don't see is more powerful than what you do see. But I think this
Right.
is maybe an example of where it does make sense to say that,
Yes.
because
It works so well.
that scene where he charges into the building, and you know, you think it's going to be like the shootout at the end of Unforgiven or something, like a real bloodbath, but it's all, you don't go in with them and you just hear the gunfire and then he comes out into the street. I think that works really well. I think the one that maybe is the best example of that, well, maybe there's a couple, but the one where he shoots that guy, Putty Nose, and
Yes.
he's playing the piano and the camera pans over to Matt and
Yes.
you hear the gunshot and you don't see what happens. But I feel like you do sort of imagine in a way, you know, Scorsese could show the blood spattering up the wall or whatever, but I think you kind of sort of draw that picture in your head with that scene. Whereas if he'd shown that killing, you know, you wouldn't have had the blood, I don't think, at that time. You would have just,
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
I think the
Yeah.
impact is better not seeing it. And then the thing with the horse, I just find that darkly comic, not in like, not because it's a horse. Well, yeah, because it's a horse, but like the fact that they would kill the horse because the horse killed the gangster, it's just
I know.
so
It's
funny.
just it shows. Again, that's another element of like in a dark comedic way that sort of toxic masculinity is like, they find he comes in his butt and tells Tom, oh, Nails got killed, and right away, Tom is, I love the way Cagney reacts, because he sort of, he doesn't, he, whatever he's experiencing or feeling, he tries to hide it, and I think that's also the trying to look tough at all costs, because what was which I'm sure we'll touch on, is that there is a real element of like surrogate families in the film, and betrayal, and actually his Nails Nathan and the other character Patty Ryan, they become like two older brother, like the older brother that he was terrible to him, and Patty was like the father to him, and so they don't betray him. They bring him into this group. They treat him well, and it was almost like he was trying not to like break down or cry, or maybe that's what he actually felt. But it's interesting that they run out of there, and it's like, and I actually didn't think they were going to do anything. And then the fact that they actually have to go and kill a horse, it's like, God, did you really think it was a calculated move? It was an
Yeah.
accident.
Well, like I had heard that certain scenes in this film, because like you say, I think it's is it an unpublished book that this film is based on? I think that's what I heard, but I'm not sure. But
I don't know.
Beer and Blood,
That's a
that
good question. I don't. I'd have to look it up. If
I think it might. I think I might have heard that. And but what I'd also heard is that certain aspects of it, you know, it was written by two guys who had been in Chicago, and a lot of the incidents are based on things that actually sort of happened in the city at that time. So I'm wondering if the murder of the horse that sort of seems sort of so crazy it must have been true in a way. I don't know. Um,
possible.
in terms of the family stuff you're talking about, that is interesting because again, you sort of think about, you know, okay, well, it's later films like The Godfather that really hit the note of like it's about family or whatever,
Right.
loyalty. But it is here to some extent. I think that's true. I mean, what did you think about, when Tom's in the hospital bed at the end
Mm,
of the film and he's like apologizing to his brother? I wasn't sure if I could quite buy it in a way because it almost seemed like I don't know if it's like his sanity had gone or something, but he seems to be fully psychotic when he charges into that building. And then they sort of walk it back a bit in the sense that he's contrite and he's in the bed and his mother's there. And I don't know. I think the afterword is definitely tacked on, but did you buy that Tom was feeling remorseful, at that point, maybe?
I did, because I think ultimately, like I said, he loses his best friend who was like a brother to him. We have this scene where this his boss's girlfriend takes advantage of him, and that, so I think those things destroyed him, his how he looked at it, shattered the way he was looking at manhood. And I think that suicide mission, as he comes out, and then I always wondered, what does "I ain't so tough" mean? That was like what he was last words. And to me, I think what he's getting at is, I think he legitimately was like, I'm not really as tough as I thought I was. And ultimately the way he looked at being tough was the wrong way. So I think he realizes, even though perhaps it happens quite quickly, but I do think he realizes that he's done a lot of wrong things, and he was doing it for the wrong reasons. So I think ultimately this moment of seeing his brother again, I think he was genuine to think, even though all he says is "I'm sorry," and he doesn't say what it's for, but he says, "Well, just for cause or for everything." I'm paraphrasing, but I think he does realize that he's made way too many one too many wrong choices, and now he's gonna die. I mean, he thought he would die, but we do see, of course, that he gets the whole thing of him getting kidnapped um and then brought home. And I mean, what an image of his, because when the door opens, it looks like he's alive, and then the body just falls. It's quite powerful. The one thing I'm not quite convinced by is the fact that the member of the gang, or the head of the gang there, Patty Ryan, when he tells his brother about the kidnapping, and then he says, "Well, I told the guys that I'll leave the racket if they bring him back." And I just thought, I don't know if like these, because what what is often at least shown, or anyone who's read about true crime, is that it's always about business, right? Business comes first. So, and everything comes second to that. It's like the classic line in Godfather, "It's strictly business," right? Nothing personal, strictly business. And so I
Yeah.
think that was a little like, I don't think that these guys would have given up all their money to get, that felt a little tacked on to me. I don't know how you felt
Yeah.
about that.
I hadn't thought about that, but listening to you talk about it, I can definitely see what you mean. Yeah, that great image at the end that you mentioned. I remember seeing this film for the first time, and I think I thought he was going to die in that shootout. When he's in the rain and he goes into the building. I think I thought that was going to be. You kind of expect them to sort of be brought right down, don't you? And it's either going to be he's going to be hauled away and put in prison,
Yeah,
or quite
yeah,
likely he's going to end up dead. And I thought the shootout would be it, and then he doesn't die in the shootout. And I don't think I actually was expecting it when the brother gets the phone call, that Tom's coming home, and it is the like you say, the thud of the corpse on the floor. It's so unceremonious in a way, but it's very stark and
yeah,
memorable. And I think the music as well. Actually, that's worth pointing out, isn't it? That there's a lot of kind of music from within the world of the film, isn't there? There isn't a musical score as
yeah.
such, but
No,
you
no,
hit
there isn't. Yeah,
you hear certain songs. I think I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, you hear two or three times, I think. And at the beginning, it's over the credits and it's quite a peppy,
yeah,
kind of upbeat rendition of it. And then the one we hear at the end is slower and more mournful. But
yeah.
yeah, I know. I think, and you hear other songs, don't you? You hear Patino singing songs on the piano. And I don't know, it helps that world of the film feel kind of lively and lived in, I think. But to the point where you don't really think about the fact there isn't a traditional score, I don't think.
Well, I thought that was an interesting choice, because it felt as though Wellman was taking like a documentary approach to it, to an extent. I mean, there are times where there's like, POV shots, like when he's young and his father comes out and sees that he stole, and it's a
Yeah.
POV. So that once you show that, you sort of break the documentary rule, so to speak. That's more of a stylized choice. But often you'll see that the camera is often moving, and it's never really distracting. But he'll sort of, he'll swing over to the faces of the camera, and then he'll pull back sometimes and show everybody in the frame. And so it adds to this kind of grittiness I felt uh to the film. And then with, also not having music, and I thought that was a strong choice. And then at the same time, like you said, with the violence, because obviously they couldn't show blood and the heads exploding back then, um to have not shown it is really, at least in this film, really powerful. For example, the after the rain scene, when he goes in, like you said, all we hear is these gunshots, and then he comes out and he's been wounded. And what really works, even what's even more effective there, is hearing that one person moaning. It's so frightening, and it almost sounds, it again, it's puts the images in your minds of, God, there's probably just a bunch of guys in there dead and dying, and a total bloodbath. So it's always interesting to me, and I'm not sure if one is necessarily better than the other, not showing or showing. But clearly in this film, they show that it's just as powerful, if not more powerful, to not show. Because like you said, I mean, perhaps it is a cliche. Oh yeah, the like Scorsese said, the third shot's in your mind, right? It's like you don't see it, so your imagination is triggered. But then, he Scorsese's a guy who shows violence, right?
Yeah.
And so I suppose it's up to the audience what they think is, I guess it's case by case. I don't know how you feel about that in general.
I think it must be case by case because something like Goodfellas is one of my favorite films, and that, in a way, is poles apart in the approach to on-screen violence to this film, isn't it? In the sense that you see a lot in Goodfellas, and it works there, and in The
Yes.
Public Enemy, it works well. Sort of, it's handled in a different way, and it works well. I think it's fine. I think you made a good point back there about the moving camera. I was quite struck by that as well. Like, there's an early scene when the beer pails are being carried out, and camera follows them across the street, and then you pick up a Salvation Army band that's kind of marching the other
Yes.
direction, and then
Yes.
as they're marching away, you sort of see the kids, and it makes you wonder how, this is a few years into the sound era, isn't it? But I
Yes.
feel like when we watched Little Caesar, I sort of remember that film being a little bit more creaky and sort of what you think of as an early sound film, in a way, a bit more static. And
Yeah.
in that film, I felt like Edward G. Robinson's performance is really what gives it a level of vitality. Whereas this film, which, like I say, only comes out a few months later, it does have a extremely like larger than life vital performance at the center of it, but it does have a lot of interesting stuff going on in terms of the cinematic technique, doesn't it? Like I say, the
Yeah.
moving camera, you sort of don't necessarily expect that, but I think it's a good example of how the perception of early sound films is not always exactly what things were like, in a way that, the camera wasn't like fully static for years and years. There were people who could
Yes.
do things like what Wellman does here. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I enjoyed sort of seeing that again, I think.
Yeah. I did too. I did too. But I know we touched on the women in the film a little bit. It's a shame because I love Joan Blondell so much. It's a shame they didn't really give her much to do. The most sort of distinctive thing that popped out was the fact that, because she gets with Matt Doyle, and she seems to have a problem with the fact that whenever Tom wants Matt to do something, he runs. And there's this great, again, another stylized shot, which is not really the some of the documentary approach we see. Is she's talking to him, and then we see Tom like right in the middle, in between, is on the staircase. And there's a similar shot with the mother in the middle of the two brothers in a standoff, and she's sort of powerless as they're both fighting, and she doesn't know what to do. And I thought it was interesting that he used that again there. But yeah, there wasn't as much for her to do. But of course, the Joan Blondell, sorry, not Joan Blondell. Who is the woman who plays his first girlfriend? I'm just trying to look it up
So
here.
is it Kitty May
Oh, here,
Clark?
yeah, May
Yeah.
Clark. That was interesting because he gets with her, and of course the famous grapefruit scene. Again, a bit of trivia there is that it was meant to be a practical joke that they worked out I read for the sake of the crew, and Wellman was like, oh yeah, I'll do this and it'll get a great laugh. But and then Wellman was like, no, I loved it. Let's keep it. And I thought that was a great choice because it shows how when he has problems with people, he doesn't know how to communicate. Like she has a problem with him and the way he is and some things about him. And he's nasty towards her and he's condescending and mean, and then shoving a piece of fruit in someone's face. It just shows that when he has a problem, he only knows how to act in aggression with aggression. Again, because that's like that toxic, that masculinity. What it's what he's comfortable with. Was that your impression of that relationship?
Yeah, I think so. And it is a shocking scene in a way that, I think Cagney's commitment to it is interesting, isn't it? Because he's properly forceful, I think, with the grapefruit and the expression on his face. He's got this kind of snarl on his face,
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
sort of see his tongue poking out between his lips. And the way he embodies that moment is a great example of what he can do, I think. Um, I had read, or I'd seen something. There's a behind the scenes thing about the film on the DVD I've got, where apparently that scene made such an impression that there are later films with James Cagney where they felt they had to sort of one up that moment. So
oh, is that
I
right?
think he does another film with May Clark like a year or two later. I think it's called Lady Killer or something like that.
Oh
But
yeah, I haven't seen that.
all I've seen is the clip they show on this DVD, which is like there's a scene where so instead of pushing the grapefruit in her face, he sort of drags her across the hotel room, across the corridor, kicks her out of the room. It becomes a whole kind of sort of set piece thing where
Right.
it's kind of like building upon the grapefruit scene. I thought with Joan Blondell, I agree with you. She didn't really have a great deal to do, but there was a funny moment I liked where it's when they first turn up at the nightclub where the two women are, and for whatever reason, the two men they're with have passed out. They call them lightweights, don't they? But there's a funny moment where one of them has sort of clearly signaled that these men should be sort of taken away, and Joan Blondell says, "We're with friends," and just as she says that, it cuts to the two men sort of being dragged away
Oh
by
yeah,
the
yeah.
staff.
The
Um,
the bouncers, I suppose.
but I think I did expect her to have a slightly more prominent role because I feel like is she no, I think it's Jean Harlow's second build, isn't she? Because there's the funny little thing where you see the actors right at the
Yes.
start of the film, isn't there? And they're all doing a bit of an express. Cagney does the short arm jab, and Edward Woods like wipes his hand across his nose, and
Yeah.
yeah, I think I expected when I saw Joan Blondell pop up, I thought she'd maybe end up with Cagney or she'd be involved with him, and I was a little bit disappointed that she wasn't in it more. I think.
Yeah, me too, because I love her. And again, as we touched on, I mean, Gwen Allen, who Jean plays, she's like the society woman. And it's interesting because he falls for her in that scene where he's basically saying, "Oh, maybe we should call it quits because it's not quite working." But he doesn't want to call it quits. I mean, that's why another reason Cagney's so great is that he brought this like boyish vulnerability to this guy who I think ultimately wants love, wants a family, wants love, wants to be successful. Which, like I said earlier, when he gets those things, and it's taken away so quickly because he's made too many wrong choices. But that scene's so interesting because she's sort of treating him like a kid, like she calls him like a boy.
Bashful boy, she
Yeah,
says.
she
Yeah.
sits on his lap, but then she like talks about, oh well, the other guys I've been with are so polite, and and like you really take, it's almost like she was attracted to his gangster tough image. But then I thought it was such an interesting contrast that yet she saw this boyishness in him, and that she was almost like that quality as well. So it's a shame. Again, it's a shame. I mean, not to criticize Harlow too much. It's a shame because she's so wooden, uh, and so flat in that scene. But it's a really good scene. I mean, I thought it's a complex scene. It's layered in the sense that she has these kind of she likes his toughness, but also likes his boyishness. I don't know. Was that your impression?
Yeah, my impression was that it is potentially a complex scene, but I did feel it was kind of undermined by the acting in a way, like you say. Like
Yes,
it is
yes.
interesting that she's kind of cradling him, and yeah, this thing about the bashful boy, and I feel like a few people. I was sort of wondering how old exactly is he, because there is that sense of is it just because he's junior in the family, or is he still very young? Because I feel like that idea of him as a boy or is he a man, it kind of comes up.
Right.
Um, But I did feel with her that some of the line readings are just so wooden in a way.
Yeah,
Like there's one moment where she says, "I feel flattered," and it's just,
yeah,
she doesn't sound flattered. And there's
right,
another
right,
one where she
right.
says, sometimes the emphasis is just all over the place. Like there's one where she says, "You don't care, do you?" And it kind of took me out of it. I have seen one or two people say, "Well, she has such a presence that it kind of overcomes that," but I kind of didn't feel that. I
No,
think,
not that did I.
yeah, I think maybe in other roles, but
Yeah,
I think she got a lot better. But I
she
don't think
did.
in
Yeah.
this one it didn't work so well. I don't think.
No, I agree. It's a shame, but if audiences, I think, just listen to what she's saying, there is a lot there to unpack. And then again, like we said, like very quickly, he has to leave, right? So it's again, it's because he makes these. It's like you can't have all these things and expect to keep going the way you are. So I think
Yeah,
that was
because is it that scene where they get the call about, is it Nails Nathan has been
yes,
killed by the
yes.
horse? So it's the
At
horse
that
who
point, yeah,
intervenes at that point. Yeah, yeah.
at that point, and they run out. But the some of the elements of betrayal are interesting because we see the betrayal. He feels as though his family has betrayed him, and then Putty knows, after they kill the cop, and they go to Putty Nose, and they're basically told, "Get the hell out of here. We're not going to help you." And you see how strongly he reacts. And again, those are elements from childhood. And so the first chance he gets years later to see that guy, right away, his first instinct is to take him out. And it's you do. I felt for that poor guy. I mean, they sort of push him around, and then even though he's a sleazy character, but they push him around in his place. And again, that famous shot where he's playing piano, and then they pan over to Matt as he I take it he likely shot him in the head. um you again, it's just when if you there's certain triggers for him where he will just take you right out. Was that your impression?
I think he explicitly said, didn't he, when he was first betrayed? I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something like, "If I ever see that guy again, he's
Yeah,
going to get it," and like it shows you that
yeah,
he's true to his word. And he didn't help his case because he's kind of lying to them right up to the end, isn't he? He's sort of saying, "I've got a woman up here," and they go up and there is no woman. And yeah,
yes.
I think it is a sign of that character, and how far he'll go. Like he didn't. This is years later. It seemed
Hmm.
like he could have easily let bygones be bygones, and it sort of takes him away from that moment as well, because that's when he's is it with Gwen at that moment? He's dancing when he sees
Yes, and he's
but he
with
knows.
her. Yes, he's with her as well, which again, Cagney's so great. It's amazing what he can do without dialogue. And you see he's having this great time, but then he has to transition to having the moment of seeing him, and you just see the hate, like the rage just comes over him. Uh so he's a great reactor, Jimmy there, but I found that to be quite compelling. Did you ever see? I don't know if you ever watched The Sopranos. There's a scene
Yeah,
where do you remember the scene where Tony is watching this film?
I can't remember where it fits in. I do remember that he watches The Public Enemy at one point. Yeah,
Yes.
I can't remember exactly like what happens as a result of it or anything, but no.
Yeah, he's it's really interesting. And again, Gandolfini was also such a great actor who can you know exactly why he's experiencing what he's experiencing, even though he's not saying anything. It's all in his behavior. And he's watching Public Enemy and he's enjoying it. They cut to him, Cagney doing the grapefruit scene, and Tony's laughing. But then they cut to the end where as he's coming home, Tom is coming home, and the mother's so excited, she's getting the bed ready and everything, and she's so happy her son's coming home. And they cut back to Tony Soprano, and he's crying. And I think he's crying because he felt his mother hated him in the show, that his mother did love him. And to see Tom's mother actually really have a very loving mother, um, is heartbreaking for him. So it's just interesting to that he's watching Public. It just shows the connection and the influence of that film.
Yeah. Well,
To
let me
have gone, he's 60, almost 70 years later. Yeah, because that would have been early 2000s, 70 years later, and you could see the influence of how they empathize with these types in a show like that.
Well, I was going to ask you about Cagney's influence in a way because I remember this story I heard, and it was about the film. Well, it was a documentary about Stanley Kubrick and Eyes Wide Shut that I saw, and Steven Spielberg was interviewed, and Spielberg was very interesting because he was talking about how when he saw The Shining at
Oh
first,
yes,
he
yes.
really didn't like it, and he had a conversation with Kubrick, and he said he sort of had to sort of fess up, but I didn't really like the film, Stanley, kind of thing. And Kubrick kind of quizzed him on it, and Spielberg said, "Well, I thought Jack Nicholson was over the top, words to that effect." And what Kubrick apparently said was, "Well, look, the reason Jack Nicholson is great in that film, and the reason Jack Nicholson doing that kind of performance is a great actor, it's the same reason that James Cagney is a great actor." And I was wondering, like, yeah, the influence on gangster stories is interesting, but I think the Nicholson comparison in certain roles makes a lot of sense too, in a way, because I don't know, like the sort of the commitment, the frenziedness of Cagney's performance here. I mean, there's so many great moments, and we haven't even touched on them all. Like, I really like the scene where he's buying the gun and he sort of turns the gun
Oh,
around on the gun seller and stick him
stick
up.
him up.
Um, but I think it's interesting to kind of draw that line, isn't it? Like maybe Cagney, maybe his influence is felt in performers like Nicholson, who maybe you wouldn't, off the face of it, think of those two together. But I think the Shining comparison makes a lot of sense. And when you look at things like White Heat as well, and Nicholson in the Batman film or whatever, I think I can sort of see some of Cagney there, in someone like Nicholson.
Well, I mean, I think his influence is strong in terms of like these films are. I would imagine this is just from my own feeling. I think part of the reason we're talking about these films that he's in is because of how great he is. Because it's the mannerisms he brings to it and the nuance, and the range. And it is interesting that people, it almost sounds like Kubrick is saying, well, yeah, Nicholson was over the top, but so is Cagney, but they're committed to that. But like you were saying earlier, I never feel that he's over the top. I think he's just such a larger than life character. He sticks out like a sore thumb. And because he's playing ruthless people, but he also is like boyish, and a part of like Tom Powers is that he's trying so hard to be tough. So maybe if there's any kind of exaggeration, it's sort of part of that element. And I know Orson Welles, they asked Welles who was the greatest film actor, and he said Cagney. And he said because even though he's on camera, he played it as if like a theater was watching, like 1,000 people are. He's is I'm not quoting him directly, and I'm not sure if they necessarily mean that he's fake or over the top and it's still good. I think they just mean that he is a larger than life character. Like he sticks out like a sore thumb, and why that is, I don't know. But he doesn't seem to be ever hammy to me, even though I mentioned he is maybe forcing it occasionally. But he seems to just be very present, and he's just a very alive and very responsive person that I think
Yeah.
that's why compared to the other people in this film he really pops, because he, like, there's one scene where he got like a vein popping out of his head, when he's arguing with his brother, because he's got a lot of feeling, I mean that's my impression anyways.
Well, yeah, and something about you used the phrase larger than life, and we've been talking a little bit about like this debate that was topical about do these films like glorify these figures
Right.
or whatever, but some of these gangster actors, whether it's Cagney or whether it's Edward G. Robinson or De Niro or Pacino, like it's so hard to see them in a way as like everyman type figures that I
Yes,
almost feel like
yes.
it kind of stops them. It sort of cuts against these films glorifying them because there's no way I can sit down and look at Cagney in The Public Enemy and think this guy is just like me. I could be like him if I did X, Y, Z. It's that larger than life quality that he has that really sticks out, I think. And yeah, I don't know. I was going to ask you, like, is he? You're watching a bunch of his films, and you're presumably seeing certain films that are not as well known as this or White
Yes.
Heat or whatever. Like, how
Yes.
dependable is he, and how adaptable is he when he's not in this kind of role, which really suits like his skills as a performer? Like, are there times when
Oh,
he's a
very,
bit less of
yeah.
a perfect fit? Would you say? And how does he sort of,
Very,
you know,
very much so. And I know what you mean. Like when you see him because he played a number of gangsters and all totally different types of gangsters. Like I just watched Love Me or Leave Me recently, which has a great first half, I felt, and then the film really goes downhill from there. But him and Debbie Reynolds are both fantastic in it, but he's a very different gangster, just like in the other films. But yeah, when he, like I'm just looking at his IMDb, like when he did something the Strawberry Blonde, like he's just like he's a dentist in that, right? And he's just a regular guy, and actually he brought that even to something, well, I shouldn't say brought it, because I think he does really kind of identify with everyman characters also. Like even if you look at him in interviews later in life, when people would say, hey, don't aren't you so proud of like the status you achieved and you're the great Jimmy Cagney? And he's like, he never sort of had any airs about that. He was always just sort of like, yeah, big deal. So what? I'm just a guy trying to earn a living. It's like he kind of had that. He had that kind of. He wasn't pretentious about anything, which I find really compelling because I find nowadays. I mean, then again, I don't always blame actors because they have to do so many interviews and so much press. It's hard for them not to say some things, but I do find sometimes you hear people say things that are just pretentious, and as they're talking about how they did what they did, it's like, but a guy Cagney would have, if they asked him, well, how'd you do this or that, he probably wouldn't. He'd probably give you a vague answer.
Mm. So
And
he wasn't somebody to sort of talk about suffering for his art or anything like that. Then
no,
no.
God, no, God, no. He just was a guy who had a job to do and did it, and that's the way he looked at it. And even if you look at him in, I don't know if you ever saw Man of a Thousand Faces, where he played Lon Chaney,
Not yet.
but at least that's the way they portray it. Is that Lon Chaney also was just looked at it as work,
Mm.
and it's interesting because in that film he was a guy who did all this like vaudeville and theater, and then once that went under because of movies, he just jumped into movies. And actually for a long time, even though he was big on vaudeville, he was like, he did background work, and he was like, whatever, like you pay me, I'll do it. And and I was like, that must have appealed to him. I would imagine that sort of not pretentious or no ego or vanity about anything.
It's good to
Again, just
hear.
from what I know, I could be, maybe there's
Yeah.
other sides to him, but from what I know and read about him, he identified with that. But that film in particular, The Strawberry Blonde, you'll see he's just a kind of an ordinary guy, and he's great. I mean, he could really do anything. Is my feeling.
I mean, I've seen a few of his films over the years, and I remember when I did that earlier podcast on The Public Enemy, I think I bought like a James Cagney box set or something, and it had The Public Enemy, it had White Heat, and I've always loved White Heat, and I think
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
that character. I think that's like his return to Warner Brothers, isn't it? Because I think Cagney had like an on again, off again relationship with Warner's, and
Yes, yeah. A lot of
rebelled
conflict
against
with
the studio at
Jack
certain points,
Warner.
and
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
he also was instrumental in starting SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, the union. He was a big part of that as well.
yeah. And then this box set also had the Roaring Twenties. I think is really good,
Oh,
and
that's really good. Yeah.
that's interesting because you're kind of a few years past the sort of Prohibition era by then, so it's kind of taken on a more nostalgic kind of feel in that kind of film in a way that it's kind of different to these films where it's a bit more ripped from the headlines. You got a bit of distance.
Yes.
And then I think there
Yes.
was one called The Fighting 69th in there, where
I haven't
I
seen
think
that one.
I feel like when World War II came along, there were films where he's kind of in the army, or I think that was one of them, and maybe wasn't quite as good
Yes.
as some of those other films, but was worth a look. So, no, a fascinating figure, and I think the film, his performance still feels contemporary to me in a way.
Yes.
Certainly, when it's offset against, like we said, there are certain performers here who seem rooted in 1931, and he really doesn't, I don't think, and that's quite an
No.
achievement.
Oh, absolutely. I do think, I mean, I find perhaps we hear, so many lists nowadays and top tens and top 100s and best this and best that. and I think lists have a lot of value. But I'm sort of hesitant sometimes to use the word best. This is the best, but I would certainly say he's up there with being one of the most versatile actors. Who, you know, how many people can you think of that won an Oscar for playing a dancing man in Yankee Doodle, but was also known as like one of the most well-known actors to play gangsters, you know, like he just it's
It's great. And like, doesn't he kind of dances down the stairs at one point in Yankee Doodle Dandy, and it's just such a great his energy just shines
yeah,
through
oh yeah,
in his
yes,
films. And
yes,
you wonder without this film though, where does that go? Because this is almost a bit like, you know, there are certain films that make a star, aren't there? Like you think of the introduction of John Wayne in Stagecoach, and that turns
yes,
John Wayne, I think, into a real star. And I think The Public Enemy must be something similar for Cagney. And if
oh
this
yeah,
hadn't have
yeah,
turned up at the right time, you know, what happens next? I really don't know. But I feel like it's one of those moments, isn't it? It's like this is
oh
what this
yeah,
performer is kind of like. This is what this person should be doing. You know, is roles like
yes.
this. You know.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Was there anything else about the film Public Enemy you wanted to mention?
I think William Wellman sounds like an interesting guy.
Oh, such a good director. Yeah,
Really good director, and an accomplished action director, and just an interesting person from what the little I've heard. You know, that he'd served in World War One, that he'd had a flying accident where you know, some kind of upright kind of pierced his helmet or something, and I got the nickname Wild Bill. And I feel like he's fully invested in this film. I think it was just an assignment in a way, but one that he really put his all into. I think he supposedly fought quite hard to get the ending of the film as it is. I think that's interesting. No, I think when you were saying about sort of the afterlife of this film in a way with The Sopranos, and what that made me remember was that I'd seen an interview with Scorsese where he had talked about doing The Aviator. And of course, in The Aviator, you've got characters like Gene Harlow or whoever. But
yes.
he said that one of the films he showed the cast of The Aviator in preparation to do the film was The Public Enemy,
Oh,
and
is that right?
said the film, you know, still got a very,
Wow.
you know, appreciative reaction 70 years down the line. So, you know, I think it, like I said at the outset, I think, you know, if you look at those early 30s gangster films, um, they're really interesting historically. This one, I think, is really entertaining, even if you sort of set that to
Yeah.
one side, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree. For I know you've been on the show before, but for people visiting us for the first time, could you talk a little bit about what your podcast is about?
Absolutely. Yep. So it's called the Movie Palace. It's been going for a few years now, and it predominantly is about classic Hollywood movies. But I do try and branch out a bit, like, you know, do the odd British film or the odd non-English language film. Like I've just done a podcast on La Diabolique, and I'm doing one soon on the film Rafifi. So yeah, if people are interested, there's about 120 episodes, I think, at this stage in the back catalogue. And at the moment, they're sort of roughly fortnightly, and it's usually me with a guest just chatting about the film for an hour or so, in a similar way to what we've been doing today, I think.
Right.
And Robert's been on it a few times, so talking about It's a Wonderful Life last year, and also talking about In a Lonely Place. We had a
Yeah.
bit of a group, like a panel discussion
Yeah.
on that film, didn't we? And
Yes.
other things in the past, like Rope. So yeah, if people want to check it out, it's the Movie Palace. It's on, you know, all the usuals, Apple, Spotify. If you search for Movie Palace Pod on things like X, you'll find us, and also on things like Instagram as well. And yeah, it'd be great if anyone does fancy checking the show out. You know,
Great. Fantastic. Well, I will leave the links in the description box where you can follow Carl on social media and check out his fantastic podcast. Carl, thanks so much again for coming on. Let's do it again sometime down the road.
absolutely. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to you about any film. So yeah, I'm well up for it. And thanks again for the invite.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the Movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner. To your top left in just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also, click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching and thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.